Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to a wonderful Wednesday webinar from the Climate Emergency Centre Network and a growing network of about 36 community eco centres across the country on the high streets, reaching out to people about community-led solutions. Tonight we have a bit of a legendary campaigner, well known on our scene, Andrew Boswell, who's from the Carbon Reckoning project, and they're challenging the UK climate against the science and international law. Andrew's going to be telling us some amazing work they're doing to push the legal issues to protect the planet. Over to you, Andrew. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Phoenix, and welcome everybody. Yes, this talk is about the Carbon Reckoning legal project, and some of you may know I've been doing legal challenges now for sort of 4 or 5 years, but this is actually a new project. Um, and I should say actually, because I think Kay from Teesside asked me about CCS or suggested she'd feedback about carbon capture and storage in Teesside, and that is indeed I have done work on that. But this talk is not about that. This is about the seventh carbon budget. However, Carbon Reckoning may in the future do more work on carbon capture and storage. But Kay, if you want to connect about incineration in Teesside and carbon capture, do sort of contact me afterwards. Um, I've put some links to the sort of background material as I'm pointing to it there on the screen. I hope you can see that. And I put it in the chat a couple of times. So, Carbon Reckoning is basically a science-based litigation campaign, and we are a group. Said Rebecca Durrant is in the group here tonight. Also, James and James Hewitt and Simon Pirani are members of the group. And we're committed to the alignment of UK climate policy with the latest science and international obligations. And the case we've just sent the first legal letter to the government on Monday is this one about the global carbon budget and how the UK takes more than a fair share, and how it's taking more than a fair share in how it set the seventh carbon budget, which you may know it set in law last month. So that's really what I'm going to talk about. I want to start by saying happy birthday to the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. That was a landmark opinion which came out of this place, the Peace Palace in The Hague, which is where the International Court of Justice basically is. And that was 1 year ago tomorrow, in fact. Everybody already seems to be already celebrating the birthday, including me, and partly because it was a really major landmark advisory opinion. That it was just an advisory opinion, but 15 judges from the International Court of Justice basically, I think the simplest way to put it is they strengthened the Paris Agreement in principle. It's not a judgment, as I said, but it's up to then individual groups to litigate that in national jurisdictions. And that's basically what I'm going to talk about tonight, and that's what the Carbon Reckoning Project is doing. So actually, one of the things which came out also celebrating the first anniversary was a report this morning from the Centre of International Environmental Law, SEAL. Now, I've added this in because I think it's a really important report, and the link is there on the slide. And it's also in that links document. But basically, this is a report saying that governments had knowledge of climate change and the impacts of climate change. They knew the impacts we would get way back from about the 1950s onwards. And in the UK case, in fact, because UK owned a third of BP back in that time in the early 50s.
Mm.
They're saying the UK, officials in the government would have had knowledge of this, even though BP and the companies were already doing work and knowing that their products, that the fossil fuel, burning the fossil fuels had a very, very bad impact on the climate. We've all known that for a while, but as people look into it, it just gets further and further that knowledge that actually people knew about this up to 75 years ago now. And they were framing this in terms of the International Court of Justice advisor opinion and the legal responsibility for climate harm. Now, this is a bit different to what I'm going to talk about because this is really about whether countries or people affected would be able to take governments to court on the basis that they knew way back in the 1950s and 60s of the harms of climate change, but they carried on and not didn't do anything about it. And as I say, that's not what my case is about, but I think what this report said is really interesting historically. So I've got a couple of bits from it coming up. So the overall for the structure of the talk, I'm going to talk about climate justice and equity and frame that whole issue. So it's really from around 1850 in the climate space, people talk about sort of counting emissions from them. They're obviously, you go right back to the Industrial Revolution, 1750. And then I'm going to take it through to Rio in 1992, and then on to Paris in 2015, and the ICJ advisory opinion last year in 2025. And it was only at Rio in 1992 that government started to actually really do anything about it. And as we know, they haven't actually done enough since then.
Mhm.
Um,
That's where we started this journey for our particular group was Rio Earth Summit.
oh,
179
right,
governments agreed
right,
on something,
right.
agenda
I've
for the
got a
21st
photograph. You
century.
might sort of know it actually coming up.
Mhm.
But I was looking through all the photographs, and that was an amazing event, and I remember
Mm.
that. And when we get to say it's really interesting how angry people were even then. People knew what was going on.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about global fair share cases, that should say, rather than fair cases. Um, but we're seeing emergence in climate litigation of what's called fair share cases, and this is all about how emissions, responsibility for emissions, and responsibility for climate change and acting on it is divided up, and whether it's being divided up fairly. And basically, we all know it isn't. And those have been going for a while. And I'll give some background with that, and then I introduced the UK carbon reckoning case, which is the case my group's just started, and that is basically a fair share case. And we'll give timeline and overview of the case. So I want to start off looking at this is actually some research from Carbon Brief back in 2023, and it's really interesting um, on the impact of colonial rule on the
Mm.
European share of historical emissions. And if you start at looking at the UK, you can see the blue line is where they're saying that's what the territorial emissions were in the UK. And this is cumulative emissions from 1850 up to 2023. And the red one is what they're saying from controlled or from colonial controlled territories. And you could see that the UK one increases sort of over 50% when you take in what the UK was doing in India and Africa and different places historically. And in fact, in the Netherlands, although they're smaller total, it's a factor of three. It increases because that's largely in Indonesia in the Netherlands case, and a very large continent, clearly with a lot of emissions in the colonial era. If you look at India, now you can see that the light blue is where they're reallocating emissions from the colonial power. So that is one example. That light blue is a blob which has landed up in this dark red bit for the UK, because that's representing the emissions from colonial India being transferred from India to the UK. This a proper analysis of the emissions under the control of the British Empire, effectively. Um, and if you look at the whole graph, um, you can see um, that the UK is very high up there when you include that. We're actually fourth overall, behind the US, China, and Russia.
Wow.
So this is quite important, because when we look at equity um, under things like the Paris Agreement um, and the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion, one of the ways we look at it is including historical emissions. And I'll come on to that later. And that basically, at the moment, the government isn't getting anywhere near that level of responsibility in terms of our climate action. So just a bit of background. I mean, we all know why that's the case, but this is a picture I found of Manchester in 1817 to see this dense forest of smoking chimneys dominating the skyline. So that was like 156 years ago. Um, and then this was a report I just saw on The Guardian, actually on Monday as well, which I thought was quite shocking, really, about the impact in India now of the extreme heat. We think we have extreme heat here, but in India, they're having heat up to sort of 40 plus, 50 degrees even. And people who are working outdoors, already extremely poor people working in construction or in agriculture, are losing up to 9% of their income. So climate is a poverty multiplier. So that's the other side of the equation. 156 years later, some of those emissions from Manchester are still up there in the atmosphere, causing the impacts we all know are sort of coming on very strongly now. So back to that early warnings report, what this is saying, that many major emitters, and they particularly highlight the UK and the US in this, had credible warnings about fossil fuel driven climate change decades before they actually claimed they knew. And in fact, scientists understood that CO2 could warm the atmosphere way back in the mid 1800s. And by the 1960s, officials in many major emitting countries had credible warning that burning fossil fuels was driving dangerous climate change.
Mm.
If you look at the Carbon Brief webpage I had up on Proof State, it's got this really brilliant animation, which I can't show you, but it actually plays from 1850 to 2023. And I just highlighted this as 1969, which was at the end of the 1960s. So the government's already knew, well, in our government's case, I think they probably knew for at least 15 years by 1969. And at that point, the UK was still the third largest emitter cumulatively from 1850 up to 1969. And the other really interesting thing in that carbon brief document is that they they show the cumulative emissions per population per capita in 2023. And when you look at that, the colonial powers, particularly the Netherlands and UK, come out right at the top. So that's that bar we're looking at earlier for the UK with the blue and the red bit now on a per capita basis. And you can see that In fact, the UK is even ahead of the US in terms of that per capita cumulative emissions, which was a surprise to me actually when I saw that.
Mm.
So here we are now in 1992, and this was really when the governments did acknowledge there was a problem. There's a huge conference there, and it actually led to three UN frameworks. One was the framework on climate change, what we call the UNFCCC, a bit of a mouthful. The Convention on Biodiversity, and also a convention on um, stopping desertification. That third one obviously still meets everything, but it doesn't get a very high profile. But the climate change one and the biodiversity one, I think everybody hears about. We have the meetings every year and so on. The COPs, um, the whatever that stands for. I can't remember the of the people anyway. I think
Conference
um,
of the parties, right?
so.
Conference of the parties, the
Conference of the
COP
Parties. That's it. Yeah.
26 thing.
So anyway, coming out of the Rio that Rio meeting, 1992, was the UNFCC, and it's a document about 25 pages, basically an international treaty or framework, and the Article 3.1 of it I've reproduced here, and this is where they introduce what is called common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And it's in the middle of that text. I'm actually about to read that out fully. But CBDRRC is the acronym which everybody throws about. Again, another mouthful. Um, but essentially, this article says the parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And that's the key phrase, which now the Paris Agreement took that further, as I'll explain in a minute, and then the International Court of Justice in the advisory opinion again effectively sort of strengthened the obligations actually um, last year. And then the last bit, accordingly, developed country parties should take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse effects thereof. So, developed countries, the rich countries, in other words, those countries who weren't admitting there was a problem till 1992, and they're also sometimes called Annex 1 countries, just for reference, 'cause I think that might come up on the future slide. So if we fast forward another 15 years, no more than
Great
15.
picture. So,
Yeah, yeah.
from the
This is one of
climate
my
camps, we got
favourite
that
ones,
resistance
Felix. I
exhibition.
love this one. This is from the Heathrow Climate Camp.
Yeah,
And
first
the
one.
reason I love it is they've got this thing like, are we armed? So we are armed only with peer reviewed science.
Mm.
I just thought that was so great. So even in 2017, climate camp people were saying that. And of course, now 19 years later, we're still trying to stop Heathrow. It's still going on. But the key thing there, really, I think, is can peer reviewed science underwrite international law? And it's taken a long time to get there. But I think we're getting close to a point where we can bring it into the courts. And the next step along the way was 2015, the Paris Agreement. Um, and it's interesting, the Paris Agreement says there in Article 2 that it aimed to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change. But as we know, it was also in many ways a very weak agreement. And it's taken another 10 years till we got to the International Court of Justice advisory opinion to start to strengthen it. Um, but as was said a minute, that we could only strengthen it by actually doing litigation because it was only an advisory opinion. It wasn't a justice, it wasn't a judgment, and it didn't actually say what needed. It didn't actually lay down exactly what needed to be done. That's got to be now developed through the courts, and
Mm.
that's one of the reasons why I'm bringing this case now to try to explore that and try to get a result really on that. But what it said about the temperature, another acronym, I'm afraid, the long-term temperature goal, LTTG, you also see a lot in the documents, is that second bit I've highlighted, which says holding an increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature to 1.5 degrees. Now, there's a few things to say about that. First of all, because it was a negotiation of 200 odd countries, that the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree is very confusing, really, and that's led to confusion because it's almost like you've got two targets there. But what happened really was that the small island states and the people most affected were arguing for 1.5 degrees. But in order to get all the countries to sign up, they put this thing in we're well below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, pursuing efforts for 1.5 degrees. That's something which has now been strengthened, as I'll show in a minute, by the International Court of Justice um, advisory opinion. The other thing to say is everybody knows we're already shooting past 1.5 degrees. Um, But 1.5 degrees in terms of these documents and in terms of the IPCC, which is the scientific based intergovernmental panel on climate change, their reports actually means overshooting 1.5 degrees and then in theory coming back to it in 2100. Now, I personally don't actually believe that coming back to it is going to be possible, or if it is possible, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult, even more difficult than the problems we're having now to even slow down climate change. I'm talking about slowing it down, completely stopping it, then coming back to 1.5 degrees. But overshoot's another term you mean. And of course, when you see me litigating that the government, isn't compliant with 1.5 degrees, well, people say, well, that's a bit meaningless because we've already gone past that, or we're going past it, this decade. But the reason we have to do that is because that's the number in the Paris Agreement and in the legal documents. But it doesn't mean to say that any of us actually believe that that's where we're going to land up anytime soon. So moving on to Greta and XR2, I mean, we in XR and Greta were always saying unite behind the science. This is Greta on the way to New York in 2019 in that yacht when she sailed across the Atlantic. XR, of course, had the target of net zero by 2025, which was a more scientifically aligned target in a sense, more actually fitted holding. Well, it might have just held things to 1.5 degrees. But as we know, net zero is at 2050 and it is nowhere near strong enough. So now we get to the ICJ, it's just exactly 1 year ago tomorrow, and the formal title, Obligation of States in Respect of Climate Change, and is just an advisory opinion, as I say. First of all, just to tie up that scientific point, at this point, clause, it's only like, I can't remember how many pages is it, maybe 300 or 400 pages, this advisory opinion. It's a huge document, but paragraph 224 here, they actually basically tie this thing down about the ambiguity of the 2 degrees and 1.5. And they sort of say, well, we note that that's what they said in the Paris Agreement, but the bit of highlighted 1.5 degrees has become the scientifically based consensus target under the Paris Agreement. So that was one of the first highlight points that this ICJAO pinned down. It actually sort of said the Paris target is actually, we're saying it's 1.5 degrees, but on the basis of the science which has happened since then and everything else. The other thing relevant to what I'm going to talk about is that it went a lot into this CBDRRC, the equity issue, the common differentiated responsibilities with respective capabilities. And it basically said that the Annex 1 countries, the rich countries, have the highest possible obligation to fulfill that equity obligation, and that they have to have the highest ambition to achieve climate targets which are consistent with 1.5 degrees. So it put these sort of strengthening statements in, but as I say, it's litigating in the national courts which are going to actually make those start to hold. There's one other legal case or legal thing I want to talk about, which is this is the Clima Seniorian. This is the Swiss, sometimes senior women, I think they call themselves. And this was the European Court of Human Rights in 2024, a year before the ICJ one. But this was another absolutely landmark climate judgment. This was a judgment from the European Court of Human Rights. And these elder Swiss women took the Swiss government to court under Article 8 of the European Court of Human Rights, which is the right to respect private and family life. And they basically said climate change is going to disrupt our human right for that. And they won against the Swiss government. And they were saying the Swiss government hadn't got strong enough targets. And I think it's still all going on, actually, because, of course, the Swiss government tried to appeal that and tried to get
Ah,
around it.
I'm
Uh,
glad you brought this up because I was going to ask you about this. So they got a big result. They won, but what the Swiss government's still kind of questioning
they are,
appealing.
yeah,
Ugh.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah. So, and that goes on in all these cases. I'll come on to in some other examples. But I just wanted to put that one there because on the fair share cases, a lot of them are based on human rights. There's a lot of it. I mean, the children's cases in the States as well. That's become a global thing.
That
That's
was my
all
next
done
question.
differently.
Go on, later for later. Go on. Yeah, they
So
challenged it, didn't they? A few kids in the Midwest of America challenged
that's
them.
right, and they haven't actually got as far as challenging the federal government, but they've made progress, and other people have copied them around the world.
So it was
That
just the state government they took to court, was it? Not the federal.
they took, yeah, I can't remember
Oh,
which one it was. It was a Midwestern state,
Ohio or
somewhere
Illinois
like
or something. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah, and yeah, the human right courts are um, the human right cases are really important in all this. But my carbon reckoning case is not based on human rights, so it's slightly different. And I just want to sort of go through some of the cases there are, because I think actually, till I sort of looking into this, I didn't realise all these cases were going on. And I followed climate litigation the whole time, so I guess most people don't know them. But there's been cases really in the last 5 years building on human rights. Some of them were before that Swiss Clima Seniorian case, but they already started building on human rights. And then when that case happened in 2024, if they were appealing or something, they then brought that case in to help them. So there's one in Italy, um, and that is on the effectively the Italian climate target, rather like my one is in the UK. Same in Switzerland. The Swiss one, there's the Aurora 1 case, sorry, not Switzerland, Sweden. Sweden now, the Aurora 1. And the Aurora 2 case is an appeal which is coming back on that. They've sort of reframed the case, and that has brought the ICJ advisory opinion in now. So you've got human rights plus whatever the ICJ says in these cases. There's two in Canada, and one is from Indigenous people.
Mm.
There's also a La Rose case. These cases, as far as I can make out, haven't. They've had difficulty getting traction in the Canadian legal system, actually.
Well, the
Uh,
Wet'suwet'en one's really interesting because they say we never ever signed a treaty with the British, Canadian, French government, so we don't recognise your law. So it's
right.
it's a campaign that
That's
needs
really
supporting.
interesting.
Mm.
Right. Yeah, I think they've, as far as I know, that one, I think it's coming back to appeal, but it,
Hmm.
unfortunately, the other thing about Canada, apart from not recognising Indigenous rights and and so on in that sense, is that they don't actually have a climate change act with targets like we have. So it's a bit,
Mm.
they're just sort of challenging the nationally determined contributions, which is the thing people had to do for the the Paris Agreement, but it's not really so much a national thing. Now the French one, this one is where it gets a bit more like what I'm trying to do in the UK because it's actually brought in as well as the human rights and the ICJ. It's bringing in French administrative law, so it's actually sort of using um, the French own law as well as part of it. And then we have the Greenpeace case, and this is called the Bonaire case in the Netherlands. Bonaire was an island in the West Indies, which was a Dutch colony, and part of this is that the Netherlands are not doing anything for adaptation for Bonaire, so they've just let them, suffer under the sort of climate impacts they're getting. But the other aspect of it is looking at the Dutch climate laws. So it's a two-pronged thing. It's looking at adaptation and funding adaptation in former colonies and the Dutch climate law. And this one is based on the human rights and the ICJ. It grapples with the Dutch climate law. It's got expert opinion on CBD RC, in other words, the equity stuff under the Paris Agreement and under the UNFCCC. Um, and in fact, the French one has also got this expert opinion coming in. Now, what I should say about that is that there's quite a large literature. It actually predates the Paris Agreement on how you apply these these equity statements which are in the treaties on climate change and on climate change targets and also on funding development overseas for climate and that sort of thing. Um, and there's actually a huge literature base, and then there's particular scientific experts who have written, basically seminal papers on this, and those are the people who are giving these expert equity evidence reports to the court. And on the basis of that, um, well, no, so what I've got here on the screen is what that expert equity report found that the any Dutch remaining carbon budget in their own national carbon budget, which would meet 1.5 degrees, is already exhausted. And if you fully bring in responsibility and capability, in fact, the Dutch exhausted it around 1996. It's only if you have an equality, which is sort of like, if you divide the carbon budget at 2022, I think it was, then you would get on an equality basis, then the Dutch would meet that very low equity metric, but that doesn't have any responsibility for past emissions. It doesn't reflect capability that the Dutch is a much Netherlands is a much richer country for doing climate action and decarbonising. As a result of that, the equivalent of the sort of High Court, it's not called the High Court in Holland, basically said that a 43% reduction at 2030 from 2019. So that's actually just 43% reduction over 11 years. And that's similar to what the IPCC was saying globally. That's where those numbers come from. They were saying that was the minimum floor, the minimum floor that um, the Netherlands should have in their climate target. And that's much more ambitious, of course, than what the Dutch government had. And the Dutch government are now appealing that. That judgment was in January. So that, as far as I know, is the first case where there's actually been some success on this fair shares, including the ICJ opinion. But it's being appealed and it's now going to go off to a long appeal process. So it's certainly not sort of, solid law as such, but it's sort of a step in the right direction. So now I want to come on to the UK cases. And there's actually two UK cases. Um, and one of them is from a group called Tipping Point. Um, they've actually got that action to the new Desnes minister on Rosebank, if you've seen that action network going around. It's also called Save Hemsby, which is a place in Norfolk where us Norfolk people know the cliff has fallen into the sea and people are losing their homes. And that is part of the sort of human rights aspect of this case. I'm not going to sort of talk about it because it's their case, and but I'm just going to say that it also is filed in February. So it's sort of like about 6, 7 months ahead of the Carbon Reckoning case. It's based on the human rights and the ICJ, and they are approaching, or if you like, litigating the whole UK climate framework. So they're saying that the UK emission targets fall short of a fair share. Now that bit's a bit similar to the Carbon Reckoning case, but they're also saying the thing we all know, that the UK isn't monitoring, well, it is monitoring, but it isn't regulating in any meaningful way its imported consumption emissions. There's no controls over those. And as we know, we've exported a lot of our emissions to sort of imported consumption emissions. Effectively, we externalize a lot of our emissions that way. And also, there's no limit on fossil fuel emissions in the UK. So that's what the Tipping Point case is litigating on. Now, moving to the Carbon Reckoning case, we put in a pre-action protocol letter on Monday, just as Andy Burnham was walking through the doors of Number 10, first time
Good
as Prime
timing.
Minister, which I have to say, Phoenix, that I didn't plan that. That was actually unplanned. It just happened, the lawyers said, we've got to get the letter. I suddenly realised that's the day Burnham's, taking over as Prime Minister. It helped a lot actually in the crowdfunding, because I think a lot of people sort of thought that was quite neat that we sent the letter in as Burnham walked in the door of Number 10, but it wasn't planned.
The wizard is
But
always perfectly on time, as Gandalf says. Yes.
that's right.
Good timing.
So if the thing about a pre-action protocol letter is that you basically tell the government, we don't think you've done this thing lawfully, um, and then they have a chance to reply. They'll say, no, we did it perfectly, lawfully, and what you're saying is totally wrong or something, and then we'll come back with filing the case in September 2026, so a couple of months' time. And when we do that, there'll be a much more developed statement of facts and grounds, it's called. And that's the thing which then all the legal arguments are based from, and that goes to the court to see whether, first of all, they'll give the case permission to go to the High Court. You have to go through the permission stages, and then um, if we do get through the permission stages, then we would probably be in the High Court early next year. Now, this case is entirely based on the Climate Change Act and the ICJ. So it's not bringing in human rights, but it's based entirely on how the process the government set the seventh carbon budget under the Climate Change Act, and then whether that's science based and whether it meets um, our international obligations. So it's a public law case only, and in some ways that makes it a lot simpler. So I think it's quite a neat and sharp case we've got, as I'll come on to. So now I want to delve into the details of it, but very much in an overview. And I would say, if you're interested in this, I'd look at, first of all, the pre-action protocol letter, which is 20 pages, and it's in the links which I put in the chat. I haven't been watching the chat, but I'll put
Um,
that
don't
link.
worry, we've been posting some of the things you've been commenting
Oh,
about,
great.
the
Okay.
links to the UN stuff, but also I've just put up the different legal cases and the tipping point and your crowdfunder so people can find out more, which has been
Oh,
pumped
brilliant. Oh,
around.
thank you for doing that. That's
And
hugely
you've even got
helpful
an
because
offer of some possible financial support from the Southeast Asian team. But I'll let you finish
oh,
up and then we'll go to some questions, Andrew.
right. How am I doing on the time?
A wizard is always perfectly on time, I think. As long as you're okay to go to 5 past, then you
Yeah.
sum up
Okay.
and we'll go to a
I'll
few questions.
Yeah. Okay. I'll whiz through this bit about the timeline and what we're doing. So this, I always say about this sort of litigation, it's a long project, and I really started back in Feb 2025 once the Committee on Climate Change gave their advice to the government on how to set the. So I lost control of the mouse there a bit and then jumped ahead. But anyway, that's the level it's setting it at. It's for 5 years, which are 12 years ahead. Which a lot of people said a bit gobsmacked. Oh, you're setting something, 12 years ahead. You're litigating how we're going to be dealing with climate policy in 12 years ahead. But that's literally how it's done. Um, it then went to the Environmental Audit Committee last autumn. They held an inquiry on that advice, basically. And several people, well, it was about 65 submissions, but several submissions were just on the question of the adequacy of the level, including one from me, one from Professor Anderson, Kevin Anderson, lots of people here know, I'm sure, from the Tyndall Centre, who's banged on about this forever. And I should say that his work has, been a guiding light to me and a huge influence on everything
He's
I've done.
brilliant. He's
He
brilliant.
is
We've had him on
absolutely
for a
brilliant.
webinar. Yeah, yeah.
So his submission, and when I watched the inquiry, they didn't really sort of talk about what we'd submitted. So I was slightly encouraged and sort of pleasantly surprised when the report came out. The committee itself obviously talked about it behind closed doors, so to speak, because they had a recommendation for the government to show how the budget aligned with the Paris obligations and the heightened responsibilities of the UK as an Annex 1 country that's a rich nation and so on. So that, in a way, was quite helpful because Parliament had already given a marker like, this is something we're worried about whether the government's getting this right. So then I wrote to the government in May, and at that time I'd only had sight of the Committee on Climate Change stuff. My basis said, it's a flawed scientific baseline. It doesn't comply with the state obligations on the obligations on states from the ICJAO. In June, then the government laid the order before Parliament, and they put with it a draft impact assessment. And in that draft impact assessment, the government said they relied on the Committee on Climate Change advice, which I'd already told them I didn't think was sort of giving lawful advice, so to speak. And it also did its own analysis. The government did its own additional analysis. And in that, it basically said that's how we meet the Environmental Audit Committee, what it's asked us to do. So I then wrote a second time to Ed Miliband. These are what we'd call informal legal letters, by the way. They weren't written by the lawyers. I have to say the lawyers checked them, but they're basically written by me, laying out why we thought it was unlawful. And this one, the second one to Ed Miliband, and basically said, well, your impact assessment doesn't cure the defects we've already told you about. And also, you don't show that you meet any of the CBDRRC equity benchmarks and the obligation to to apply the Paris Agreement and equity under the Paris Agreement. They
Mm.
then went ahead and they made the order on June the 25th. And just legally, that making of the order is the decision that we are challenging. You have to legally challenge some decision the government has made. In this case, it was Ed Miliband then, as the Secretary of State, making that decision to make the order. So then we got to Monday this week. We've issued the pre-action protocol letter, and the two grounds are very simple. That basically the Secretary of State didn't take lawful account of scientific knowledge about climate change, and that actually is a literal quote out of the Climate Change Act,
Wow.
Section 10.2a. There's a duty to take scientific knowledge about climate change into account. And ground two is failed to ensure the budget level accorded with any methodology that allocated emissions reductions responsibly between states that is consistent with the principle of CBDRRC. So that's literally the wording we've got in that pre-action protocol letter, or very, very close to it. And that's a breach of a duty under Section 8 of the Climate Change Act, which says that the Secretary of State has to take international issues into account. And as I say, that's when Andy Burnham became Prime Minister and Miata became the designated Secretary of State. I've just got about 2 or 3 more slides which explains those grounds in a bit more detail. If I've got time,
Yeah,
just
go through them and then we'll have a few questions. I'm sure some folk will be able to stay a bit longer. They're 60 in the house
yeah,
to listen to you. So carry on,
okay.
Andy. Give them a
So
bit of time at the end. Yeah.
one thing it's worth saying is that the way they do this is by something called the balance pathway, and this is a a figure out of the Committee on Climate Change Advice. And the sort of this line up here is sort of historic emissions. And then the dark blue line is this thing called the balance pathway. Now, the first thing to say about that is they never work it out from any of the international documents. They don't work it out from the IPCC documents and and what we call the remaining global carbon budget. They actually develop it bottom up by basically saying, well, this is what we were doing in the sixth carbon budget, or this is what we projected for the sixth carbon budget, and we'll tweak it a bit because, well, we think we might decarbonize industry a bit quicker. Transport might be slower or something, whatever it is. And the difference between the dashed line, which is the baseline if they do nothing, and this balanced pathway, that difference is all the policies they've got. So this is where how they set the climate target and the climate budget drives the climate policies because they have to fill this gap. But the key point is they never work it out from the international data in the first place, right? And the second point, just to put the sort of framing of that, is this seventh carbon budget we're looking at. As I said a few minutes ago, it's 12 years out. It's just that little bit of it. So it's a long way out down that pathway. But the important thing to know is there is a pathway, because in a minute I'm going to talk about how they do compare it to the international stuff. So What they say is they first of all say in this advice to the government on setting the seventh carbon budget, they say the IPCC sixth assessment report, that's 6AR, provides the scientific basis for advice. So they're saying that's where our scientific advice is. Then they say, oh, that says there's 500 gigatons of remaining global carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. This, as I say, this mythical 1.5 degrees, but this is the number they talk about. Then they say, oh, the pathways to get to that assume deep and immediate cuts in emissions globally from 2020. Now, as I've highlighted in red here, this is where it gets interesting legally. The Committee on Climate Change then acknowledged that those deep and immediate cuts didn't happen. And as a result, the global carbon budget has been eroded more quickly than it would have been. And at the time they were writing, one of the latest figures was 235 as instead of 500. And over half of it had been used up by the time they wrote this report in 2025. In fact, now that number is more like just over 100 in 2026 with further scientific reports. But in terms of what they were saying in February 2025, that's the figure they were talking about. Now, as I've just said, they derive that pathway from a bottom-up analysis. They don't derive it from the remaining global carbon budget. What they do is they do a post hoc check, having derived that pathway, which was the blue one on the previous slide. They then compare it, but they compare it against the AR6 pathways, which are based on that 500, not the latest scientific literature. So although they've acknowledged the latest scientific literature exists. So if I try to put that more simply, basically what they say is, we're basing everything on a report which was written in 2020, and the final one, 2023. We know that said that these deep cuts had to happen. We know they haven't happened. We know there's more up-to-date figures and not new pathways quite actually, but it implies that there should be steeper pathways and so on. Then they basically say, well, we ignore that and we just compare our budget to the old data from 2020. So that's one of the key points in our legal case, that they even acknowledge that the science is more up to date than the science they're actually using. And of course, it's critically up to date that there's half the remaining global carbon budget yet. It's not sort of like, a small amount difference. It's a big difference. I just wanted to sort of show that graphically. This is a report called the UNEP Emissions Gap Report. And this is published every year, and it's got a lot of IPC authors on it. So basically, it is basically updating the IPCC reports in real time annually every year. Now, what this report said in this last one was, we pointed out that the historical emissions have gone up. And what they were saying in 2020 with the AR6 report, that they should be going down like that. So this is the same point again, but I'm showing it graphically. This is what was meant to happen. And this is what the government are basing the seventh carbon budget on, that was what was meant to happen. But in fact, this is exactly the same graph, just another version of it. That's actually what happened. Emissions went up, they haven't reduced, and that's what happened instead. So what the UK is doing is setting a carbon budget for a world which no longer exists on the science. And
That's summing it up.
that's
Yeah.
a key point. That was the science bit. I think this is the last but one slide. What they do on the international obligations, this is from that impact assessment where they're trying to say, oh, we're meeting the international obligations, right, just before they set the order. They put this table in, which looks a bit complicated, but I've got a simple way to show it. The percentage figures are there And the seventh carbon budget is an 87% from 1990. These figures are also percentages from 1990 when you allocate the emissions to the UK based on different equity metrics, they call them. So these are different ways in that big literature I was talking about looking at equity. These are different ways of applying it. Well, two of them in the literature basically just says these ones are not consistent with equity. They're not consistent with the Paris Agreement. So those ones get scrubbed out before they even started, though the government is still putting them in their documents for some reason. These ones are sort of like, okay, they're consistent and the percentages are different because they're different levels of capacity and responsibility. Those are sort of technical terms in the literature. If you divided the global carbon budget up, the UK would have to reduce emissions by 165% from 1990, which basically means, going into negative emissions in 2040. That's what that means. Um, so in other words, as we know, the UK, like the Dutch, have gone past using up their 1.5 budget anyway.
Mm.
But the critical thing about the numbers is that none of the numbers actually, um, well, all those numbers require more than the 87% reduction than the seventh carbon budget is doing. So none of them meet the international obligation. And that basically is the second part of the legal case, explained graphically in one slide, hopefully. So, yeah, I am on the final slide now. So I think I've already said that we hope to be in court either at the end of this year or early next year. The estimated cost would be £100,000 for a court case like this. Um, Please help and support if you can. And thanks, Phoenix, putting the crowd justice into the crowdfunder into the chat. But what I'd also like to say is that there's lots of ways that people could help me in non-financial support because I'm the sort of one-man band trying to become a group called Carbon Reckoning and trying to sort of become a bit more than a one-man band. So if anybody's interested, I just want to put this out there. If anybody's interested in helping in this, and it could be lots of ways. It could be like social media support. It could be getting into the detail of writing blogs and things on the case, and turning my sort of stuff into something that people can understand would be really helpful
Right.
skill. If anybody's got that,
Well,
those sort of skills, anybody's interested, do contact me for non-financial support. Thank you.
Andrew absolutely smashed it. Really incredible information there all the way through. Know that many, many minds are with you and support you and want to lift your hands up and your funds up and support you. So, if anyone has got a comment or a short question, we'll probably run till quarter past ish, although there's a lot in that, so we want to flow a little bit more. But what to say is, if anyone can help Andrew in other ways, I know as with the CC network, there's a few people doing too much with too few funds all the time. And if anyone has any of those skills that Andrew's just mentioned and wants to contact him, I'm sure there's a way to contact him and the carbon reckoning project. Please get in touch and help him. So if while you want to put your hands up, if you've got a question, a comment or feedback, I just like to share one of the things. Last time Andrew did a webinar with us to show the effect that never doubt that one person and many people can make a massive difference. The last time Andrew did a webinar with us about a year ago on carbon capture and storage, very comprehensive. And about a week and a half, 2 weeks later, we got an email from the head of the government £20 billion carbon capture and storage department. And he said, "Hello, I'm responsible for carbon capture and storage in this country. Maybe we could, can you give us a webinar so we can answer back to what Andrew said?" So I think we mentioned that to Andrew, and we haven't set up the thing yet because we don't necessarily want to give them the airtime on carbon capture. But what I'm trying to say here is that it really makes an effect when you get the message out there, when you raise awareness, and we represent ourselves for years in court up to the illegal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan when we occupied Parliament Square. It's really important to hold their feet to the fire legally as well as with policy changes, as well as with direct action. So anyone out there with a question, a comment or feedback or an offer of help? If you stop sharing your screen, Andrew,
Yeah,
better
yeah,
see a
good
few out
to
there.
see faces.
Mm, brilliant.
Yeah.
So, anyone out there first? Helen Hart, the Leeds team, University Challenge.
Yeah, it's not really a question for Andrew. It's a comeback to that where they wanted you to host them a webinar. And I'm just thinking, I remember going to see uh, Third Energy explaining to the people of Kirby Misperton why fracking would be good for them, and they were laughed off the stage. So having them in front of the right audience could be quite funny.
Maybe we could set something up. Yeah. Well, I did think I joked to Andrew. I think we could have a celebrity death match. I don't know exactly what that is. I think it's a TV show, but with Andrew Boswell on one side and the other guy, and someone fairly referee it, so they each get active time to listen and hear, maybe and reply. But we'll have to talk to Andrew about that. Is there any offers of help out there in the house who would like to put their hand up now for a question, or for put their hand up? They'd like to help Andrew in his great quest and what he's doing. I think Michael Yin has mentioned, do you need some funding? And he works with a lot of Southeast Asian sustainability groups or
Oh,
something.
right.
Michael, are you there? Do you want to say anything about what you thought about tonight, or anyone else? Or we can wrap up soon. Diane.
Just very simple. There was a program on a couple of weeks ago with a guy who said about making millions, which is we don't want to make millions ourselves, but he mentioned a group of people who, because of fuel poverty action, I'm aware there is a group of people who are very happy to pay more taxes. They're millionaires and they understand about putting money into the central pot that can go out again. And I tomorrow I'll write a letter to some of those. I'm not sure who they are, but to say, come on, let's share the money because it's a very special year this year. It is the year for action. So if we can do a couple of things like this, like you say, do a celebrity death match thing, and ask the people who've got some to give some to share fairly.
Nice,
Yes,
nice.
that is Patriotic Millionaires with Gary, and I can't remember Gary's other name at the moment,
Mm.
but the
Stevenson.
Economist guy, Stephen Stevenson, yeah, Gary Stevenson, he's
Patriotic
brilliant.
millionaires, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're great. I've
Okay.
spoken to some of them. They're great. Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
fantastic. Yeah, that's
All
what we
right.
need. I think there's David, then Janet Shaw, then John Bagina.
Uh,
David.
I just
You
wanted to say thank you to Andrew for, um, and I know you're a scientist, and I know this is you're passionate about it, but the amount of stuff you have to go through and juggle with and interrogate and understand. Um, Thank you so much for doing that on our behalf, because very few of us have the capability of doing what you're doing, and it is amazing, and it's a really complicated stuff. And thank you for trying to summarize it for us mere mortals. But
oh,
keep
thank you,
keep
David.
on keeping on.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Nice. Yeah, brilliant, Dave. Big up the MP Watch Massive. Over to Janet Shaw and then John, then Genji.
Uh, Hello, it's not actually Janet Shaw, it's Tim Dowson. I'm with her watching the
Okay.
the thing. It's been great. Thanks very much for all of that. There's a great deal there, and I guess we'll absorb a bit of it. What I'm wondering is, you were talking about litigation in lots of different countries around the world, and I've certainly heard about bits and pieces in other Western countries in particular. Do you know much about the success of cases in other countries? And crucially, not just a legal success, do you know if any of the successful challenges in other countries have resulted in a change in government policies in those countries? Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, are you talking about litigation in general or the fair share cases we've been talking
Um,
about?
I, I'm talking about litigation to do with climate, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, climate litigation is a hugely big area now. It's been
Yes.
going about 10 years. There's a database of cases which has got something like 3,600 on them
Wow.
around the world. A huge amount actually in the States, believe it or not. I mean, all the stuff, for example, that Trump is rolling back um, were things which the Obama administration put in 2009, and some of those, resulted because there'd been litigation before that. So it actually goes back quite a long way. Um, to give a number of cases which have been, high real landmarks. I mean, that Climacenorian one from Switzerland is a landmark in the EU for human rights and climate change. There's one in the UK called Finch, which was that's named after Sarah Finch, actually, who's a fellow person like me. Almost a one-woman person to start with, though she's now got quite a group around her. And that one has had a really big impact, actually. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. She lost at the High Court and the Appeal Court, so it shows if you will go for a long time, you might succeed. It took her 5 years. And it's this one about if a company wants to mine fossil fuels, and this literally was mining in Surrey, but of course it applies in the North Sea or wherever. If they want to do that, they were assessing for the environmental impact the effect of doing that just on the basis of the extraction operation. So in this case, in Surrey, it's actually just running a drill and people turning up in their cars every day to work. They weren't accounting for the emissions from burning those
Mm,
fossil fuels downstream.
mm,
And Sarah Finch won that in the end, that they have to now account for the downstream emissions. And that's one of the things which has held back Rosebank, actually,
right.
because of the
Great.
Finch judgment, Supreme Court, there's been subsequent judgments on Rosebank which have gone against it and said they've got to redo the environmental impact assessment on it. Now, it hasn't completely closed it down,
Right.
and when the government may still go ahead with it, but it's made it a lot harder. And I think the other thing which has come out of that Finch case is it's had a whole national debate. And I'd even say the cases I've done before, particularly on carbon capture, we were talking about the carbon capture thing earlier, um, and I took government to court on a carbon capture scheme in Teesside. I lost at the High Court in the summer 2024, lost in the appeal court last spring. But that case raised the profile of carbon capture as an issue nationally. So
Mm,
there's now a lot of people who know it's an issue. That, for example, the George Monbiot article just a week ago, probably a lot of people saw that George has known for a long time that it's an issue. But it raised the profile of the whole debate on carbon capture, even though I lost the case. So climate litigation is worthwhile. And one of the things with the carbon reckoning case that I want to do is to build the communication thing around it. Because in some ways, I would say, and I have not been optimistic here, but I'm sort of slightly further ahead on this case than I was on the carbon capture one 2 or 3 years ago in terms of having a sort of sharper case. As I presented it, you can see that it just comes down to those two grounds and they're quite clear.
mm,
Whereas the carbon capture one's a lot more complicated, actually. So I'm sort of further ahead on that. But what we've got to do now is communicate that to people and really get it out there that this will drive um, more climate action if we were to win this case, and even just having the case may drive more climate action because we're not doing our fair share internationally. We're not actually doing our sort of fair share of the global carbon budget even. And yet the UK is a leader in climate diplomacy. I always say it's very good at saying we're brilliant, and to a
mm,
certain extent, it is good. I don't want to undermine that because the UK has led in some ways, but it's very, very good at saying we're good. It doesn't always walk the talk. So,
Mm.
and that's there's a whole raft of stuff we need to get out there. I'm sorry, Tim. I probably went a bit further than your question, but I hope it.
No, no, that's great. I mean, in fact, that's the sort of thing I'm interested in, because there's a disparity between legal cases being successful in
Mm,
general and effective
mm,
change in government policy. But in
yeah.
fact, just holding things up is useful.
Yeah,
Mm,
I think that's a really good point. And we'll come over to John and Genji, and then I think James Harvey had his hand up. But never doubt that a few people, that Horse Hill ruling with
mm,
Lady Finch, that just started as an anti-fracking camp. I remember dropping some pallets off in a van, and
mm,
a few people pushing and pushing, and then that
yeah.
ruling could
Mm,
then be used to hold up Rosebank later because the
yeah.
future
Yeah.
emissions
Yeah.
aren't being counted
Yeah.
was major. Thank you for being patient, folks. Over to
Yeah.
John and then Genji, and if James Harvey still has a question. We'll probably wrap it up after James Harvey, but very interesting tonight, very powerful. Please get behind Andrew and support him, folks. Any offers of support, get in touch. John.
Totally. Thank you very much. Andrew, actually, you led me very nicely into what I was going to say. So my background is I've been in this country for 60 years. I have a hippie background, hippie. So love, peace, flowers,
Mm,
nature,
mm,
totally natural to me.
mm,
20 years ago, I woke up and went, oh, this is not looking good. And then the Tories came in and I went, this definitely is not looking good. So joined the Labour Party, and of course, the last elections, total victory and majority was down to me uh, because I was supporting them. So what I'm going to say to you, Andrew, I think you've already alluded to it. The Labour government is doing as much as it can.
Hmm.
It is certainly talking the talk. And with Miliband, we have seen some real progress, some fantastic progress. Uh, Totally unbelievable in
mm,
the Tory era, for example.
mm,
So what I'm going to say to you is, please keep putting the pressure up. From
mm,
the little that I've seen, well, quite a bit actually, I'm quite a nerd of watching the parliamentary TV program. I get the clear impression from ministers that they need pressure. They need public to come up and go, oi, more,
mm,
more. This is good.
Yeah.
Fine. Yeah, give us more, give us more. So whatever you do, I think will penetrate and will give them an excuse to go further and further and further. Thank you, Andrew.
Brilliant.
yeah. That's a really important point, actually. Yeah, giving cover to the politicians and seeing the people are for it.
Hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you, guys. And move it along a little quicker.
Thank you, John.
Genji, and then if James Harvey still had a question, and if Andrew, is there an email people can contact you with offers of help? If you want to stick
Yeah, I put
that,
it in
maybe.
the chat a while back. I'll do it
I'll pop
again.
it in again if you can. Genji, and then James Harvey, if you still had a question, pop your hand up again. Or Genji, I'm.
Hey Andrew, thank you so much for that. I just am amazed at how so much detail, and I was captivated the whole time. So thank you so much for that. And I guess I'm trying to work out, almost like in a nutshell, are you saying, so I've written it down, the seventh carbon budget is based on reducing on a target that was never reached in the first place?
Yeah, yeah, effectively.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Because that is
oh,
something I can say to people.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
That's what it comes down to, really. And
Right.
it's all sort of, in the documents, it's gone on about how complicated the documents are. Others have said that it's all smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to suss out that's what they're doing, really. But that is what they're doing.
Thanks so much for condensing that down for us, mate. That's bloody amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, Kim,
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Genji, for all you do. Is James Harvey still with us? James, did you have a hand up earlier and get popped down again?
Yeah, I did, but it's mostly been answered. I just put a comment in the chat about it that Andrew, you know that I completely support you in this. Here's another
yeah,
arrow in the climate action quiver. I just don't trust the judiciary anymore after rulings with so many controversial rulings, and it always depends what judge you get. And
Yeah.
it seems like they're in the pocket of the establishment, and by that I mean fossil oil and gas companies and politicians. But it does all count because it is we've got to come at it from lots of different angles, and like Friends of the Earth prove, it can make they can win. They can
Yeah.
win. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that the Friends of the Earth case, actually, that was one. Yeah, thank you very much, James, and thank you for all your support. Actually, I should say that because you've sort of supported me quite a lot on this. And the um, the Friends of the Earth case was another one, which was a great win. Actually, and I missed that one out. And we haven't made my lawyer public actually, but here I'll say that it is the same lawyer who's on that one about the climate plan, the net zero strategy, and then the carbon budget delivery plan. And that's one where they've twice shown the government climate plan. And that's the gap, but that's the gap between that dashed line and the solid blue line on that graph. Twice they've shown that the government don't have a coherent plan of how they fill that gap. And that was an amazing case. So actually, we can win cases, and where the just coming back to that point you made, James, about it's really difficult the judiciary, and I do really agree with that because I've lost on cases which seems obviously clear to me when I started, but um, this is different from the ones I've done before on roads and the net zero T side in that it isn't infrastructure. This is more about the sort of public law and about how the process in which they set the carbon budget. So there's no deadline they're going to miss by this legal case going through. Whereas on the net zero T side, there was huge pressure on that case on the judges, I think, because they they tried to expedite the case. That was one of the ways they tried to um, highlight, that they were really unhappy about it, and they made all these claims. We're losing hundreds of millions of pounds a month that they were claiming because it's all made up money on the construction of the thing. So it was delaying the construction, and um, it went right to the top of the um, court system to decide when the appeal case is going to be held because of that. I mean, I haven't really talked publicly about this, but the fact that they did that put a hell of a lot of pressure on the judges in that case, So, yeah, there is pressure put on these judges, but this case is quite different in a way because it's arguing about process, and there's no time in which they have to sort it out in a way. And they won't, in a sense, they won't reset the seventh carbon budget. But what they might do is say there has to be a review of it and review of the process. And that's really what we're aiming for. So I think there's more chances in a case like this because it's less tied up with this whole build, build, build thing, which is where the politicians have got very angry in the past. Anyway, that's my take on that.
All right.
I'm
Thank you.
always an optimist.
You have it's the best survival tactic to be optimistic in my book. I've been through a lot of intense situations in our lives on many front lines, and it's really, really important to stay optimistic and have some hope and know that there are thousands of peoples and projects all over the world working on good projects. I think there's an offer of funding for you somewhere we can chat about later, Andrew. So just thank you everyone for coming. I'm just posting in the next week's webinar is kindly hosted by the Enfield Climate Action Forum. And basically, sorry, it's a bit longer, but it's in the chat now. They've got an MP turning up. It's about what can we do about our heating planet? In the past few years, 40 degrees. In a few years, it'll be 40 degrees average temperature for July. So Tony Perkins, the MP, as chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, will be there next week, and Dr. Mira Khosra, from Senior Research Fellow from East London. So that link's in the chat, and it'll be on the WhatsApp as well. Andrew, thank you so much for coming. You're absolute legend. I'm going to Michael, did you want to chip one in at the end? Quick one. Did you pop your hand up?
Yes, I think you asked me to talk, so I'll try my best to keep it short because I think
Yes. Quick.
yeah, I think we there is a lot of battles across the field for climate change, not just in the UK and also in Asia, in Africa, in South America, and so forth. We're all fighting the same battle. I think from the way I'm seeing things right now. Recently, I think on the climate finance side, the tariff has hurt the financing quite badly. But I think it's
Michael,
probably.
could you get closer to your microphone? Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Hello.
Not
Can you
too
hear me?
well.
Not too loud. Okay. Hello. Hello.
Volume up, maybe.
Volume up. Let me
Keep-
test them.
Wait, hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Oh,
much
yes,
better.
much
Okay,
better.
okay, I know why. Yeah, it's okay. So what I say is that the battle for to push for more climate action is across the world. It's not just in the UK. We need to work together because I think we are struggling in terms of resources, in terms of the tariff. I think recently I was doing a podcast just now on how the tariff has hurt climate profits as well, up to I think they reduced it by 41%. That is quite bad in a way. So I think we need to push back on the tariff as well. And kind of, I think we're moving to a new world order in a way where many of our leaders are not able to like understand or even address climate action on a level that we wish them to be. So I think the best way moving forward is to actually depend on ourselves, and work together as a consortium rather than on a local level. Because if you
Nice.
do it, for example, for us also, if you do it alone, we can't do it properly. We may even, fail because we don't have but if we do it as a community, if we do it as a global community, like what we see, I had to use football because I think recently we have in the football, all the world come together to kind of like, fight against the unfairness. That's why I'm happy that Argentina lose because they are unfair. They have played cheated and all this stuff. But I think it's the same thing here. Many of
Yeah.
these oil and gas lobbyists has played unfairly. They know the game from the beginning. They have cheated the system, and we had to fight back together. And you can see the strength in numbers in a way. If the whole world can address unfairness in football, COVID together, I think we can do a lot more wonders with climate change, but we need to kind of coordinate together.
Let's do it, Michael. And just briefly, you're from a Southeast Asian Sustainable Business Group network, is it? Don't know if you've got a web link you can pop in the chat, but you're most welcome and thank you for, saying that. Wise words. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Pop a link in the chat if you've got one, or there's a WhatsApp chat you can join, folks, for linking up with Southeast Asian team who let's get global, folks. Andrew, over to you for parting comments, summary. Thank you so much for coming. Keep up with the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Lawfare. We need this, and any help the CEC network and anyone here can give it.
Well,
Email Andrew. Over to you, Andrew.
thank you very much. I think the only
Comment.
thing I want to say, actually, Phoenix, is to thank you for running these webinars because, as far as I can make out, you do them every week. And I don't know how you do it because it's quite a big undertaking that. And I just think it's super. And I think you gave me a week's notice, but to do this one, but I just prepared it today, so I hope it came across. And as I said, I need lots of people to help me communicating. That's the only thing I ask.
It's an honor to have you, and thank you for bigging us up because there's a small team doing way too much with not enough resources to be on the team, and it really is guerrilla TV for
Yeah, totally.
35 years since the Rio Earth Summit this end. We literally hit the stage running each week. No idea what's going on behind the scenes. And we do the best we can to get people each week. Sometimes we've got a few webinars ahead. Sometimes we've just found someone a few days before. But we're busy with a lot of projects, helping a lot of group of people. So thank you for recognising that work. And thank you for all the work you're doing because, like I say at the beginning, many, many minds are with you. And we need to get this lawfare working group going, whatever the word is. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. We'll stop the recording just there and get it out to people tonight, hopefully. Thank you very much. Genji, do you want the last word?
I was just going to say, Michael, please feel free to share this webinar link across the world. And also, if you want to contact us, cecoutreachteam@gmail.com. We've got lots of little bite-sized jobs that we'd love to have you in the volunteering team. to join us. Thank you.
All right, folks, wherever you are, volunteer and help support good planetary causes. Take care. We'll stop the recording now.